We have passed an important milestone. The Justice Department's Inspector General has now been investigating Operation Fast and Furious, the scandal there, for longer than the Warren Commission needed to produce its report on the JFK assassination. Fast and Furious allowed thousands of U.S. guns to be taken into Mexico and sold to narco-terror groups. Some of those guns have been used for murders by cartels against Mexican citizens and others involved in the murders of 3 U.S. law enforcement agents. Why this program was started in the first place doesn't make much sense, but why it was allowed to continue for so long has boggled the mind until now. Let's start with a myth. Have you heard that 90% of the guns being used by drug cartels in Mexico are coming from the United States? Well, it was that myth that prompted the Justice Department and the ATF, first under President Bush and to continue under President Obama, to enact a program to track U.S. guns being sold into Mexico. But were the operations Gunrunner and Fast and Furious really based upon facts? The answer is no. While the ATF has said that 90% of all the guns being found at crime scenes in Mexico have come from the United States, those numbers are simply not accurate. According to a 2008 report from the Government Accountability Office, 90% of all the guns in Mexico that are confiscated by Mexican authorities and then sent back to the United States are confirmed to have come from the U.S. But how many guns are we actually talking about? According to the GAO, fewer than 11%. The rest don't come back here for verification because Mexican authorities are able to identify those weapons as from China, Venezuela, and the largest number belong to Mexican military. So when Fast and Furious and Gunrunner began, they were operations based upon a flawed idea. But as the operations went forward, agents with the ATF, under the direction of the Justice Department, began working with gun store owners in Arizona. Now, these agents would order owners to sell multiple weapons to repeat buyers. Those straw buyers were then taking the weapons south of the border and selling them to drug cartels. The feds were supposed to be tracking those weapons as they went south, but they started losing track of them. Even after losing track, the feds kept the program going. It wasn't until Border Patrol agent Brian Terry was killed with one of those guns that the curtain came down and investigations into what the feds were doing took place. So the question here, did the feds have another motive as part of the reason for pushing Fast and Furious, even after they started to lose control of the program? Well, documents obtained by CBS News show that the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives, the ATF, discussed using their covert operation Fast and Furious to argue for controversial new rules about gun sales. Emails show they discussed using the sales, including the sales encouraged by the ATF, to justify a new gun regulation called Demand Letter 3. That would require some U.S. gun shops to report the sale of multiple rifles or long guns. Demand Letter 3, by the way, was so called because it would be the third ATF program demanding that gun dealers report tracing information. On April 25th of this year, ATF announced plans to implement Demand Letter 3. Now, the National Shooting Sports Foundation is suing the ATF to stop these new rules. It calls the regulation an illegal attempt to enforce a law that Congress never passed. The ATF is countering that it has reasonably targeted guns used most often to commit violent crimes in Mexico, especially by drug gangs. So here's what you need to know. These repeated gun sales that the ATF is so worried about preventing were only happening with Fast and Furious because the feds were forcing gun dealers to sell those rifles. Is it any wonder that the American people can't trust Washington? The bottom line here, the feds created the problem that resulted in hundreds, if not thousands, of Mexican people dying violent deaths. They then got caught, but are still trying to move forward with a law to protect the people in Mexico from the problem they created in the first place. By the way, I'll let you know when the internal investigation on Fast and Furious is over with. And that is Reality Check.